Imagine this. I extract a tiny piece of tissue from your brain, use it in a lab with stem cells, and 3D print a structurally identical brain. I submerge this brain in nutrient solution, connect it to a supercomputer, and simulate every sensory signal your body receives. Temperature, touch, even the feeling of a sneeze. So here's the question. Could that cloned version of you sense the existence of an I? Would it qualify as having a soul? To answer that, we first need to understand how the self inside our original brain is shaped in the first place. Today, we're re-exploring that question through a neural lens, touching on childhood trauma, gaslighting, psychological manipulation, drug addiction, hypnotherapy, and the ultimate question of what a soul even is. To unravel these mysteries, we have to look back to the very beginning of life and ask, how is the brain's foundation laid? The growth of a human being from the brain's perspective is a precise exercise in urban planning. A newborn arrives with over 100 billion neurons, but they barely connected. Between ages 0 and 3, neurons forge synaptic connections at a rate of millions per second. This is neuroplasticity. Then, during adolescence, the brain begins to prune. Neural pathways that get used frequently are reinforced into highways. Those that go unused are snipped away. This is why childhood experiences cut so deep. They literally determine the foundational architecture of your brain, your personality, your sense of safety. At their core, these are simply the firing efficiency of specific circuits between your prefrontal cortex and your limbic system. In a loving, secure environment, the brain methodically lays down wide, well-paved channels for rational thought and emotional regulation, giving the child a healthy sense of self and a stable inner core. But imagine instead a child who faces repeated neglect, abuse, or profound uncertainty in their earliest years. How does their brain respond? In the name of survival, the brain's alarm center, the amygdala, becomes overdeveloped, locked in a state of chronic hyperactivation. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and emotional regulation, languishes from a lack of safe, nurturing interaction. Neuroplasticity plays a cruel trick. In order to adapt to a threatening environment, the brain paves the circuits for fear and defense into an 8-lane expressway, while leaving the pathways for trust and relaxation to deteriorate into muddy back roads. This is the neurological truth of childhood trauma. Not simply an emotional wound, but a structural distortion, a brain built on a blueprint of danger. Childhood lays the brain's foundation, but that foundation is not impenetrable. When we look at adulthood, we find that the brain sometimes faces a far more violent physical assault. The most striking example is drugs. Ordinary pleasures, a good meal, a conversation with a friend, trigger modest releases of dopamine, producing that quiet everyday sense of satisfaction. But what do drugs do? Take methamphetamine. It can cause dopamine concentrations in the synaptic cleft to spike to more than 10 times their normal level. Drug molecules either impersonate dopamine and force their way in, or they sabotage the brain's recycling mechanism. It is like pulling a super pleasure alarm at the neurological level. To protect itself, the brain can only respond by down-regulating its dopamine receptors. The consequence: what used to be a mountain vista becomes a gentle slope. You can no longer feel pleasure from ordinary life, only a relentless craving for the drug. This is a failure of willpower. It is the physical restructuring of your neural circuitry, a hijacked, malformed development. And when you try to stop, something even more terrifying strikes back: withdrawal. Because your dopamine receptors have already been drastically reduced, cutting off the drug sends your brain's pleasure signaling capacity into freefall, crashing to an absolute zero. In that moment, it isn't merely that joy has been stripped away. The brain's anti-reward system, including the habenula, fires into full activation, flooding the body with stress hormones. What the addicted person experiences is emptiness. It is searing, bone, deep agony, as if 1,000 ants are gnawing from within, alongside paralyzing terror and depression. To quiet this neurochemical collapse, the brain's most primal instincts scream at you to find the drug again. Quitting is just willpower. It is brutal hand-to-hand combat with a brain that has already mutated against you. If drugs represent a chemical act of violent seizure, then many people in everyday life face a different kind of damage, one that draws no blood, yet reshapes them just as completely. That is psychological manipulation. Childhood trauma is an early carving, but the gaslighting and psychological manipulation many people encounter in adulthood are far harder to detect. Gaslighting takes its name from the 1944 film Gaslight. It describes how a manipulator, through persistent denial of your feelings and perceptions, gradually causes you to doubt your own memory, judgment, and sanity. In the workplace, in intimate relationships, or online, you may have heard lines like, "You are too sensitive. I was just joking. I am being hard on you because I care. Without me, nobody would want you." What do these words do at the neural level? First, they repeatedly activate your amygdala, keeping you in a state of sustained low-grade fear and anxiety. Second, they suppress your prefrontal cortex's capacity for rational assessment. When someone continually invalidates your perception of reality, your internal GPS eventually breaks down. You begin to genuinely wonder, am I the one who is wrong? Third, they exploit the darker side of neuroplasticity. Long-term invalidation causes the brain to actively weaken its self-belief circuitry, while strengthening its submission and people-pleasing circuits. This is why victims of psychological manipulation, often accomplished, capable people, come to feel worthless. This is a thin skin. This is your neural circuitry being deliberately, systematically rewritten by someone else. Whether it is neglect from a family of origin or manipulation by an adult partner, both operate through the same neural mechanism, using persistent false signals to forcibly reshape your synaptic connections. If neural circuitry can be damaged and manipulated, can it also be repaired? Yes, it can. This brings us to an intervention that seems mysterious, but is, in fact, a sophisticated form of neurosocial engineering, hypnotherapy. From a neuroscientific standpoint, hypnosis doesn't put you to sleep. It quiets the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain's internal critic, its logic, enforcing watchdog, allowing it to temporarily stand down. When this critical function is subdued, the hypnotherapist's suggestions can bypass it entirely, reaching directly into the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. At that point, when the therapist tells you your arm feels very light, your somatosensory cortex actually adjusts its signals, and you genuinely feel your arm beginning to float. This isn't mere suggestion. It is language temporarily modifying the weight your brain assigns to reality versus imagination. How does a hypnotherapist bypass your defenses? Step 1. Disarm attention. Using a monotone voice, slow breathing cues, or a fixed gaze, they exhaust your vigilance network, like making a security guard stare at a flickering screen until his focus dissolves. Step 2. Open a side door. Once the critical mind relaxes, the hypnotherapist issues instructions directly to the motor and somatosensory cortex. A suggestion like, notice the lightness in your right hand. It may begin to lift causes the brain to automatically simulate the sensation of floating, while the part of the mind that asks, is this real, is temporarily offline. The suggestion has hacked directly into your perceptual system. Step 3. Exploit predictive processing. The brain is wired to anticipate the outcomes of actions. When the therapist suggests your eyelids feel as heavy as lead, your brain generates a prediction and then produces exactly that heaviness. You cannot stop a brain from executing its own accepted predictions. For childhood trauma, specifically, hypnotherapy works through dissociation and reintegration. In a hypnotic state, the amygdala, the emotional core of traumatic memory, is safely activated, while the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are able to observe from a third-person vantage point. The therapist might guide you. See that younger version of you. Now imagine your adult self walking over and holding them. What is happening neurologically? You are overlaying a new, calm emotional response onto the old circuits of fear. This process is called memory reconsolidation. Each time a memory is recalled, it becomes briefly malleable, and introducing a new experience in that window can physically rewrite its synaptic encoding. This is why hypnotherapy shows measurable clinical results with PTSD, anxiety, and phobias. It is not magic. It is the directed use of attention and suggestion to reshape neuroplasticity. The fact that we can achieve this kind of self-awareness and self-transcendence exists precisely because we carry this extraordinarily complex, living brain. And when we place this unique biological mechanism alongside today's most celebrated artificial intelligence, the boundary between them becomes unmistakable. Modern deep learning is genuinely a tribute to the brain. At the microscopic level, an artificial neuron is practically a digital replica of a biological one. It receives multiple input signals, assigns different weights to each, mirroring the relative strength of our synaptic connections, and then passes them through an activation function that determines whether to fire a signal to the next layer, replicating the threshold mechanism of a biological action potential. At the macro level, AI refines its weights through exposure to vast datasets. Much like the brain strengthens its synaptic connections through experience, in what we call neuroplasticity. But the underlying mechanisms are worlds apart. Modern AI learning depends heavily on an algorithm called backpropagation. It requires a wrong answer first, then transmits that error backward through the network layer by layer, updating all weights through complex calculus. The human brain cannot perform reverse computation. Instead, we follow Hebbian learning, neurons that fire together, wire together, operating through local chemical, electrical signals in real time. This fundamental difference in architecture produces staggering contrasts. In energy use, your brain runs on roughly the power of a light bulb, yet performs computations that would require a nuclear power plant if attempted by a top AI system in learning efficiency. An AI needs millions of images of cats before it can recognize one, while you need only see a cat once. And most critically, subjective experience. When an AI processes the word red, it executes a string of operations: wavelength, 620 nanometers. Output. When your brain processes red, it conjures a childhood memory. The scent of a rose, perhaps a flicker of unease. AI has information processing. It does not have the felt quality of experience, what philosophers call qualia. It is precisely this subjective, emotionally saturated quality of experience that brings us back to where we began. Now, back to the question we opened with. If I cloned you at the neural level in full, plugged you into a perfect virtual world, would that it, and the present, you feel any different from the inside? From a purely neural functionalist perspective, no difference. The electronic signals received by the cloned brain and the bioelectrical signals in yours share the same mathematical structure, even if their substrates differ. The brain recognizes patterns, not mediums. From the clone's perspective, it genuinely believes it ate steak last night, slept a full night, and woke up as you. But there is one profound difference: continuity. The reason you feel like you is because you carry an unbroken chain of memory stretching from infancy to this moment. Your sense of having a soul arises from that continuous, never interrupted narrative of I, the clone. Despite possessing every memory, has, at least by the intuitive standard of selfhood we all live by, a consciousness that only came into existence the second it was switched on. It believes it has lived for 30 years. In reality, it is 1 second old. Its experiences are real, but its existence is fractured. As for what a soul is, within the framework of neuroscience, the soul is not a substance. It is a process. It is the self being continuously reshaped by neuroplasticity, the narrator produced by the ongoing collision between sensory input and memory. If the soul exists anywhere, it is in that warm, viscerally felt sense of being alive, the thing this biological machine generates simply by running. So, back to reality. Protect your neural circuitry. Don't let drugs hijack it. Don't let childhood trauma or psychological manipulation silently carve it into someone else. S-shape. You have the means to reshape it on your own terms. Because whatever the substrate, flesh, or code, the version of you that can feel a breeze, ache with love, and lie awake wondering, who am I? Remains, in this known universe, genuinely singular. And that singularity has always been yours to hold. Your brain is not your prison, it is your instrument. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is our greatest motivation, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.